Hello! In today's video, we will continue our discussion of genetics and go a little bit deeper into the process of how an organism's DNA eventually results in the traits that we see exhibited in the organism. So as a reminder from our previous videos in our genetics unit, we know that in the cell's nucleus is DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, which is the material that contains all of the genetic material and instructions that an organism needs. We know that that DNA eventually results in the traits that we see in the organism, or the characteristics that the organisms have, such as eye color, height, hair color, fur color on a rabbit, and any of the other millions of characteristics that we can see in an organism. So if we know that all of these traits are caused by an organism's DNA, but how is it possible that this genetic code, this material in an organism's cells, results in all of these different and varying traits? So we know that our DNA is our genetic code. This is the genetic material found in our cells, which gives the organisms all of the instructions it needs for what the organism is going to look like, how it will act, and everything else about the organism. So we know that sections of our DNA are called genes, and these are small sections along the length of DNA that code for a specific trait. So for instance, we could have a section of DNA that codes for hair color, another one that codes for height, blood type, and again, all of the other countless characteristics that an organism will have. Now in a gene, we will see that it is made up of a code. This code is made up of the letters A, T, C, and G in infinitely many different orders. And based on whatever code the organism has on this gene, it will determine the trait that the organism possesses. So why is it that this code can determine the traits that an organism will have? So let's talk about the process of going from DNA to trait. The first step is that our DNA leads to protein. So along a length of a gene, we know that it is made up of a code. Again, that code is in the letters A, C, T, and G. This code provides the instructions or the directions for the protein that the cell should produce. So you can think of the genetic code like a protein recipe. So whatever code that organism has on that gene will tell the cells what type of protein to make. Now these codes are broken up into little sections made up of 3 letters. These are called codons, you don't need to know that, but each set of 3 letters, or each codon, translates into basically a word, telling the cell which part of a protein to make. Let's look at an example. So for instance, if along the length of a gene, we have the letters CUU, this code tells the cell to make a protein called leucine. If it had the code GAA, this would tell the cell to make glutamic acid. Now, as we go along the length of the DNA, we have millions of these little 3-letter codes that come together to create a full recipe or a full set of instructions for what proteins that organism's cell should produce. So remember, the first step is taking our DNA, which is a code that gives instructions, just like a recipe, for which proteins the cell should make. So here we can see all of the different codes that we might see along the length of a gene. And we know that based on that code, the cells will know which protein to make. Here are just some examples of what proteins look like. Okay, so again, DNA, or our genes, contain a code which gives our cells directions to produce the proteins that the cell needs. So we go from gene, your cells will read that code and understand which protein to make, and eventually that is the protein that will be produced in that organism. So now that we have the protein, we are then able to go from protein to trait. So each protein in an organism performs or does a different function. That means it has a different job or it produces a different outcome. Because that protein does something different, that protein being produced will result in the expression of a different trait. So based on the protein that is produced will determine the trait that we see in the organism. So for example, we have a couple human proteins here. The first one up at the top is called the SOX9 protein. This protein, if it's produced in a cell, will result in that person producing more melanin, which means that they will come with a darker skin color. On the other hand, if their cells read a code to produce the VOZ8 protein, this is a protein that results in no melanin being produced, hence the person will have a lighter skin. So we can see here that the type of protein that is made, which we remember is based on the genetic code on that gene, determines the trait that we will see in the organism. So different proteins perform different functions, meaning they have different jobs and will eventually lead to different traits being seen in the organism. So from protein, we are able to determine the trait that the organism will have. So one protein that is coded for might lead to one trait, like dark skin, whereas a different protein will lead to a different trait or different characteristic, such as light or more fair skin. So now that we know each step of the process of going from our DNA to the traits that we see in the organism, let's go over the whole process to make sure we have it. So again, we know that DNA, or the genetic material, is found in every organism's cells. We know that the individual sections that code for a trait are called a gene, and that's where we start. We know that the code found on the gene of the organism will code for, or will give the instructions for, the protein that should be produced. And we know that each different protein performs a different function that will eventually lead to a different trait being reflected in the organism. So again, the code found on the organism's gene gives the instructions for the protein that should be created, and the protein created and the function that it performs determines the trait or the characteristic that will be seen in the organism.